The river is black, not with blood, but with ink. Millions of pages, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, 500 years of human thought dissolving into the Tigris. On the banks, the bodies are stacked so high the Mongol cavalry has to ride around them. Somewhere in a palace, a man wrapped in a carpet is being trampled to death by horses. He was the most powerful man in the Islamic world. It took 13 days to erase everything. In the year 1258, the greatest city on the planet was destroyed. Not over centuries, not through slow decline, in 13 days. Baghdad, a city of over 1 million people, a city with hospitals that performed surgery, libraries that held more books than all of Europe combined, scholars who were calculating the circumference of the earth while most of Europe couldn't read. And in less than 2 weeks, the Mongol Empire turned all of it into ash, corpses, and black water. Here's the question this video is going to answer. What happens to the world when the most advanced civilization on Earth is erased in 13 days? Because the answer isn't just medieval history. The consequences of those 13 days are still shaping the world you live in right now. And I promise you, your school never taught you this. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what existed. And the best way to do that is through one building, the House of Wisdom. Imagine a place that's part library, part university, part research lab, and part translation bureau, all rolled into one. Now imagine it's been running for over 400 years. The Abbasid caliphs who built Baghdad in 762 AD had a radical idea. Knowledge has no nationality. They hired scholars from everywhere: Christians, Jews, Persians, Indians, Greeks, anyone with expertise. And they put them all in the same building and said, translate everything, preserve everything, improve everything. The result was insane. While medieval Europe was still arguing about how many angels could fit on the head of a pin, scholars in Baghdad were doing algebra, a word that literally comes from Arabic, al-jabr. They were refining the works of Aristotle and Galen. They were developing surgical techniques that European doctors wouldn't attempt for centuries. They were mapping the stars with instruments so precise that some of their astronomical calculations were more accurate than anything Europe produced until the telescope was invented. They built mechanical clocks and programmable automata, essentially medieval robots that no one in Christendom could replicate. Think of it as the MIT, Library of Congress, and Google Translate of the medieval world, except it had a 4-century head start. And the city matched the institution. Baghdad had over 1 million people when London had 50,000. It had 36 public libraries. It had hospitals with separate wards for different diseases and doctors who had to pass licensing exams. But here's the thing. By the 1250s, this golden age was running on fumes. The Abbasid Caliphate had been in slow decline for 2 centuries. The caliphs had lost real political and military power. They were figureheads, like the later Holy Roman emperors, holding a title that meant less and less each decade. Regional warlords and rival dynasties had carved up the empire. The military had been neglected. The walls hadn't been properly maintained. And the caliph sitting on the throne when it all came crashing down? Al-Mustasim. History has not been kind to this man, and honestly, he earned it. Al-Mustasim was a man who loved his palace, loved his poets, loved his gardens, and absolutely refused to look at the storm building on his eastern horizon. He was, by most accounts, more interested in keeping pigeons than keeping his kingdom intact, because that storm had a name: the Mongol Empire. By the 1250s, the Mongols controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, from Korea to Hungary. They had already destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, wiped entire cities off the map as a deliberate message: surrender or cease to exist. And now, Mancha Khan, the great Khan himself, had turned his attention to two targets: Song dynasty China in the east and the Abbasid Caliphate in the west. He sent his brother, Hulagu, to handle Baghdad, and Hulagu didn't travel light, but we'll get to the size of his army in a moment, and trust me, the numbers are going to make your jaw drop. First, Mancha Khan sent a message to Al-Mustasim, the standard Mongol deal: submit, pay tribute, tear down your walls, appear before the Khan in person. It was the same offer they'd given dozens of kingdoms. The ones that accepted survived. The ones that refused were annihilated. There was no third option. Al-Mustasim had advisors screaming at him to submit. His own military commander, a man named Ibeg, begged him to mobilize the army, to call for reinforcements from Egypt, from Syria, from anyone who would listen. But the caliph listened to a different advisor. His vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, told him everything would be fine. Some historians believe al-Alqami was actively sabotaging the defense, possibly conspiring with the Mongols because of a personal grudge against the caliph's inner circle. Whether that's true or not, the result was the same. Al-Mustasim sent a reply to the most powerful empire on earth that was, by every account, shockingly arrogant. He essentially told Mancha Khan to back off. He threatened that the entire Islamic world would rise up if Baghdad was attacked. He didn't mobilize his army, he didn't call for allies, he didn't reinforce his walls. He sat in his palace, kept his pigeons, and waited. And Hulagu Khan started marching.
Now, everything I just told you about Baghdad's Golden Age, its scholars, its libraries, centuries of accumulated knowledge, I need you to hold all of that in your mind, because everything you just learned about, it's about to be methodically, systematically, and deliberately destroyed. Not as collateral damage, as policy. The Mongols didn't accidentally burn Baghdad, they executed it.
Hulagu assembled what might be the largest Mongol army ever put into the field. Estimates vary, but most historians put it at around 150,000 troops, and that's a conservative number. Some sources say it was closer to 200,000. To put that in perspective, the entire English army at the Battle of Agincourt was about 6,000 men. Hulagu brought 25 times that. The entire First Crusade, all the armies of all the Crusader states combined, numbered maybe 35,000 fighting men. Hulagu had 4 times that. This was not an army, this was a civilization on the move. And it wasn't just cavalry with bows. Hulagu brought Chinese siege engineers, the best in the world at the time, who could build catapults, trebuchets, and early gunpowder weapons. He brought Persian engineers who specialized in tunneling under walls and collapsing fortifications from below. He brought Armenian Christian troops, Georgian soldiers, and warriors from virtually every conquered nation in the Mongol Empire. This was a multinational, multi-ethnic killing machine designed for one purpose: cracking open the most fortified city in the Islamic world. Hulagu marched from modern-day Iran along multiple routes, a deliberate strategy to prevent any single army from blocking his advance. He absorbed or destroyed every smaller force in his path. Cities that surrendered were spared. Cities that resisted were erased, their populations slaughtered, skulls stacked into pyramids outside the ruined walls, so the next city down the road would get the message. By late January 1258, the army had reached the outskirts of Baghdad, and this is where things get really dark. Al-Mustasim finally woke up to the reality of what was bearing down on him, far, far too late. He scrambled together a force of about 20,000 cavalry and sent them out to meet the Mongols outside the city walls. It was a disaster, an absolute catastrophe. The Mongols used a tactic they'd perfected across half a century of conquest: the feigned retreat. They pulled back, let the caliph's cavalry charge forward in triumphant pursuit, and then destroyed the dikes and levees along the Tigris River. The floodwaters trapped the Abbasid army in open marshland. Thousands drowned in their armor. Those who survived were picked off by Mongol archers, men stuck in mud up to their waists being used as target practice. The caliph's entire field army was gone in a single afternoon. Now Baghdad stood completely alone. No field army, no allies coming, walls that hadn't been properly maintained, and 150,000 Mongols tightening the noose. Hulagu's engineers built a palisade and ditch encircling the entire city, a wall around the walls. Chinese-designed trebuchets hurled stones at the fortifications day and night, targeting weak points that Mongol scouts had identified weeks earlier. And here's where the moral complexity comes in, because this isn't a simple story of good versus evil. Hulagu actually sent multiple offers of negotiation during the siege. "Submit now," he said, "and I will spare the population. Come out, tear down your walls, and your people will live." There's a genuine historical debate about whether he meant it. The Mongols did have a documented track record of honoring surrender terms when cities capitulated before the walls were breached. Other cities had submitted and survived. But Al-Mustasim kept stalling. He offered partial concessions, tried to buy time, maybe hoping for a miracle, reinforcements from Egypt, divine intervention, a plague in the Mongol camp, something, anything. But nothing came. The Egyptian Mamluks, who were the most powerful Muslim military force remaining, and who would later become the first army to ever defeat the Mongols in open battle at Ain Jalut, did absolutely nothing to help Baghdad. The other Islamic powers, the Ayyubids, the minor sultanates, did nothing. Everyone watched from a safe distance. No one helped. It's the 13th century equivalent of watching a country get invaded on live television while the rest of the world issues strongly worded statements and sends thoughts and prayers. By February 5, 1258, the Mongols had breached the eastern wall. Soldiers poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. And Al-Mustasim, the man who had refused to prepare, refused to negotiate, refused to flee, finally tried to surrender. He sent envoys offering unconditional submission. Everything, anything. Hulagu's response was ice cold. Come out yourself. Bring your family. Bring your treasure. On February 10, 1258, Al-Mustasim walked out of Baghdad and into Mongol custody. The city's fate was sealed.
On February 13th, 1258, Hulagu Khan gave the order. For 7 days, his army was granted permission to do whatever they wanted to the city and its people. No restrictions, no rules. 7 days of total, unrestricted destruction. What followed is one of the single worst events in the history of human civilization. And it wasn't just people who died, it was the future. The killing started immediately. Mongol soldiers swept through Baghdad district by district, street by street. Civilians who hid in attics were found and dragged out. Families who barricaded themselves in cellars were smoked out. Thousands who fled to mosques, packing into holy buildings, praying, believing surely even the Mongols wouldn't violate sacred ground, were killed inside the mosques. The Mongols did not share their concept of sanctuary. The Grand Library, gone. The House of Wisdom, that 400-year-old engine of human knowledge, destroyed. Soldiers grabbed manuscripts by the armful and threw them into the Tigris, not by the dozen, by the hundreds of thousands. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, engineering, optics, centuries of scholarship drawn from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab traditions, painstakingly translated, debated, refined, expanded, all of it dumped into a river like garbage. Contemporary sources, multiple independent accounts, say the Tigris ran black with ink for days. Other accounts claim the water ran red with blood on one bank and black with ink on the other. Whether every detail is literally true doesn't matter. The scale of destruction was so vast that chroniclers across different cultures all recorded the same essential horror. The hospitals were burned. The observatories, where astronomers had been tracking planetary movements with extraordinary precision, were smashed. The irrigation canal system that had kept Mesopotamia fertile for thousands of years was systematically wrecked. Canals blocked, levees broken, aqueducts demolished. This wasn't random looting by soldiers out of control. This was infrastructure annihilation, the deliberate dismantling of everything that made a civilization function. Every aqueduct smashed, every canal dammed, every mechanism of governance, learning, and daily life deliberately, methodically taken apart. The death toll is disputed. Medieval chroniclers exaggerated, and they had every incentive to amplify the horror. But conservative modern estimates put it between 200,000 and 300,000 killed in a single week. Some medieval Arab historians claimed 500,000. Persian sources said 1,000,000. Whatever the actual number, and we will never truly know, a thriving city of 1,000,000 souls was reduced to a depopulated skeleton in 7 days. The stench was so overwhelming that Hulagu moved his camp upwind. Now, the Caliph, al-Mustasim, had surrendered. He'd walked out of the city with his family, his court, and his treasury. He'd given Hulagu everything he asked, and Hulagu had a problem. Mongol tradition held a superstition, or perhaps a deeply held spiritual belief, that spilling royal blood directly onto the ground was taboo. It would anger Tengri, the sky god. It would invite catastrophe upon the killer. You could execute a king, but you had to be creative about it. So Hulagu found a workaround that has become one of history's most grimly iconic images. He had al-Mustasim wrapped in a carpet and then had his cavalry ride horses back and forth over it until the man inside was crushed to death. No royal blood touched the earth. The superstition was satisfied. The caliph was dead. Problem solved. With that, the Abbasid Caliphate, over 500 years old, was finished. The institution that had been the symbolic and spiritual center of Sunni Islam for half a millennium was gone. Not diminished, not reformed, gone. Imagine if an outside force, not another Christian power, but a completely alien civilization, killed the Pope, burned the Vatican, and slaughtered the population of Rome. That's the closest Western analogy to what this meant for the Muslim world. And the knowledge. Here's what keeps historians up at night. We don't fully know what was lost. By definition, we can't. Manuscripts existed in Baghdad that had no copies anywhere else on Earth. Original works of science, mathematics, and philosophy that existed as single handwritten volumes. When those pages hit the Tigris, they didn't just get wet, they ceased to exist forever. We will never know their titles. We will never know their authors. Some historians estimate that the destruction set the Islamic world's scientific development back centuries. Others argue it killed it entirely. The intellectual tradition that had flourished for 5 centuries was shattered beyond repair. The Golden Age was already declining, but Baghdad's fall didn't end a chapter, it burned the entire book.
Baghdad would never recover. Not really. Not in the 13th century, not in any century since. For generations after the siege, the city was a husk, a fraction of its former population, its grand buildings rubble, its canals choked with silt. The irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian agriculture for thousands of years were never fully repaired. The region that had been the fertile breadbasket of the Middle East became arid and depopulated. Farmland turned to dust. Villages were abandoned. The intellectual center of gravity shifted permanently, west to Cairo, east to the Ottoman and Safavid empires, and eventually, decisively, to Europe. And that shift matters enormously, because Europe's Renaissance didn't happen in a vacuum. Many of the Greek and Roman texts that fueled it, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, had been preserved and expanded by scholars working in Baghdad and across the Islamic world. These texts were lost to Europe during the Dark Ages. They survived because Arab scholars translated them into Arabic, corrected them, commented on them, and built upon their ideas. When those works finally reached Europe through translation centers in Spain and Sicily, they ignited an intellectual revolution. The Renaissance owes a debt to Baghdad that most Westerners never learn about. But Baghdad itself, the place that wasn't just preserving ancient ideas, but actively pushing them further, combining Greek logic with Indian mathematics and Persian engineering to create something entirely new, was gone, burned, drowned in its own river. So what was lost? We cannot fully know. That's the cruel irony. The scholars of Baghdad were doing advanced algebra and optics in the 9th century. Europe didn't reach that level until the 16th or 17th century. That's a 600-year gap that might have closed much sooner if Baghdad had survived. What medicines were never discovered? What astronomical observations were never made? What breakthroughs never happened because the people who would have made them were killed in a single week? Those questions have no answers, and that's the point. That's the true horror of what happened in Baghdad. Not just the people who died, but the futures that were never born. And the geopolitical echoes are just as massive. The destruction of the caliphate created a power vacuum across the Middle East that took centuries to fill, eventually claimed by the Ottoman Empire, and later by the colonial borders drawn by Britain and France after World War I. The modern Middle East, its borders, its conflicts, its fractured relationship with the West, has roots that trace back to a February week in 1258, when the old order was obliterated and nothing adequate replaced it. 13 days. That's all it took to redirect the course of human civilization.
There's something uniquely terrifying about the destruction of knowledge. When you kill a person, you end a life. When you burn a library, you end 1,000 futures that never get to exist. The scholars of Baghdad didn't just understand the world. They were actively making it better. They were building something. And it was taken, not by time, not by decay, not by some inevitable historical force, but by a deliberate human decision. One man said no when he should have said yes. Another man said destroy it all. And the world we live in, the borders on our maps, the balance of power between East and West, the technologies that arrived centuries later than they should have, all of it echoes back to a river running black with ink.
So here's what I want to know. Drop it in the comments. If you could save one thing from Baghdad before the siege, one manuscript, one invention, one scholar, what would it be and why? I genuinely want to hear your answers. Now, remember the Mamluks, the Egyptian dynasty that sat back and did nothing while Baghdad burned? 2 years after the fall of Baghdad, the Mongol army kept marching west. They hit Syria, they took Damascus, and then they turned south toward Egypt. And the Mamluks, the same people who'd abandoned Baghdad, suddenly realized they were next. What happened next is one of the most shocking upsets in military history, because in 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut in modern-day Israel, the Mamluks did something no army in the world had managed to do. They beat the Mongols in open battle, and they didn't just beat them, they broke the myth of Mongol invincibility forever. That story, how an army of former slaves defeated the most powerful empire on Earth, is our next episode. So if you want to see that one, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. I'm dropping it next week. This is History Rewind, the stories your school never taught you. I'll see you in the next one.